Hold your positions, men. We must hold this fort at all costs.
Pour mon frère. En joue.
Fire!
Feu!
The dawn of the 18th century was marked by a slew of shifting alliances and devastating wars. Major powers like Britain, France, Austria, and Spain vied for dominance over Europe, while their colonial ambitions fueled disputes across Africa, India, and the Americas. This was the period of change, where small aristocratic cabinet wars were soon to be overshadowed by the advent of larger state wars. Struggles over royal succession and economic supremacy often led to military standoffs at regional levels. These confrontations set the stage for an even greater conflict, one that would erupt into the first true global war. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia ended the Great 30 Years' War, establishing a fragile balance of power that was often threatened by internal divisions and greater disputes over territory on the continent. Warfare itself was frequent, and the major powers of Europe were in a constant state of readiness for the next conflict. By the mid-1700s, a number of European kingdoms and empires emerged as the preeminent states within the continent. Whether through military supremacy, colonial domination, or economic control, these nations were bound together in a complex web of alliances and rivalries that went far beyond their national borders. Every decision that they made could potentially tip the global balance of power. The Kingdom of Great Britain was a dominant maritime power with a vast colonial empire, spanning North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. Britain's naval supremacy allowed it to control critical trade routes and colonies, bringing immense wealth and strategic advantages. The British economy and political stability was effectively steered by its colonial ambitions, leading to frequent clashes with France over territorial claims and influence, especially in North America and India. For the British, their colonies were their lifeline to power, but not their only means of influence. In Central Europe, the electorate of Hanover was joined to Great Britain in a personal union, as the ruling house of Hanover was also the same family that ruled Great Britain. This often meant that the British monarchs had personal stakes in events on the continent, even if it didn't impact Britain directly. The Kingdom of France, under Louis XV, was a major power with significant influence both on the European continent and overseas. The French colonial empire included many territories contested by the British. France's rivalry with Britain was especially fierce, leading to numerous conflicts over colonies and trade. In Europe itself, France remained a preeminent power, but Louis XV struggled to maintain control of French dominance after the aggressive warring of his great predecessor, Louis XIV, or the Sun King, whose exploits had left the French state with heavy debts and a number of internal issues. The Kingdom of Prussia, led by Friedrich II, was an emerging military powerhouse that aimed to assert itself as a leading power in Central Europe. The Prussian kingdom was renowned for its disciplined and effective army, which would become vital for Prussian ambitions to expand into the Holy Roman Empire. For Friedrich himself, acquiring territory at the expense of neighboring Austria and their Habsburg rulers would be necessary for his state to reign supreme in Central Europe. In contrast to Friedrich was the Habsburg monarchy under the newly crowned Maria Theresa, While the family seat was housed in Austria, the Habsburg dynasty controlled a vast swath of holdings all across the Low Countries and various principalities within the Holy Roman Empire. This extensive and diverse empire left the new empress facing a myriad of internal challenges and external threats from rival states like Prussia. In the east, the Russian Empire continued to press its claims over the continent. Under Tsarina Elizabeth, Russia was expanding its influence westward into Europe and southward into the Ottoman Empire. Its vast resources and growing military strength gave Russia the impetus to directly challenge rivals like Austria, Prussia, and the Ottoman Empire, as it sought to extend territory, secure trade routes, and assert dominance over contested regions. In the west lay the Kingdom of Spain, under the rule of Ferdinand VI, who struggled to steer his kingdom through its period of growing decline. The Spanish glory days that came with the age of exploration were over. A number of costly wars, such as the War of Spanish Succession, forced Ferdinand to maintain a policy of neutrality while his kingdom focused on internal reforms and recovery. Despite this, Spain remained a notable colonial power, with territories in the Americas and the Philippines. Spanish strategic interests were focused on protecting and expanding its colonial holdings, often leading to conflicts with Britain and France. As the political climate in Europe became increasingly tense, war and conflict continued to be a significant shaper of international relations. Diplomacy was often determined by royal succession and the whims of European aristocracy, with dynastic disputes frequently igniting broader conflicts. By 1740, Maria Theresa's contested succession to the Habsburg throne following Emperor Charles VI's death left the Austrians vulnerable. The new empress was challenged by states like Prussia, France, Spain, and Bavaria, among others, igniting a fearsome war that saw Friedrich II invade Silesia, while major battles played out across much of Central Europe and the Austrian Netherlands. By 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle confirmed Maria Theresa's right to be empress. Yet the war left many rivalries unresolved, and the balance of power remained precarious. A significant realignment was needed to shift this balance. That realignment came in the diplomatic revolution of 1756, where several great powers forged new alliances in an attempt to bolster their political standing or gain enough influence to pursue their own national agendas. In Austria's case, their diplomatic agenda was heavily influenced by the desire to reclaim Silesia. Traditionally, Austria and Britain had been allies, but the growing threat of Prussia prompted Austria to seek new partners, ones who were stronger, who could curtail Prussia's growing influence. Under the guidance of Chancellor Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, Austria entered into an alliance with France, its former rival. In response, Britain aligned itself with Prussia. One key factor was the need to protect the electorate of Hanover, whose territory was still ruled by King George II in his capacity as elector. Hanover was strategically vulnerable to French and Austrian aggression, and an alliance with Prussia provided a strong military counterbalance in this region. Moreover, Britain aimed to maintain its dominance in global trade. By supporting Prussia, Britain sought to keep France occupied in Europe, thereby diverting French resources and attention away from colonial conflicts. This strategy was designed to protect and expand Britain's colonial interests, especially in North America and India, where British and French forces were still in direct competition. The diplomatic revolution was crucial because it dramatically reshaped the balance of power in Europe. Old alliances were discarded in favor of new partnerships that better served the strategic needs of the time. This realignment of forces created a highly volatile environment where traditional rivalries were upended and the stage was set for a global conflict. In effect, old enemies became allies, while former allies turned into adversaries. While these diplomatic maneuvers reshaped European alliances, conflicts also boiled over into the colonial territories. In North America, Britain sought to expand westward from its coastal colonies, while the French aimed to connect their territories from Canada to Louisiana. It wasn't long before the two began stepping on each other's toes, as the Ohio River Valley became a flashpoint for conflict between the two great powers. In 1754, the skirmish at Jumonville Glen saw French-Canadian soldiers ambushed by native Iroquois warriors and British troops led by a young George Washington. Retaliation by French forces erupted into pitched battle at Fort Necessity, with Washington leading a force of provincial troops in the failed defense of the Great Meadows against French forces. Washington's defeat and subsequent surrender at Fort Necessity marked a turning point. The French terms of surrender included an inadvertent admission of responsibility for the assassination of the commanding officer killed at Jumonville Glen. This mistranslation by Washington's Dutch interpreter, Jacob van Braam, had serious diplomatic consequences and helped ignite the French and Indian War. During that same year in India, the Second Carnatic War was drawing to a close. Both Britain and France had supported rival claimants to the throne of the Carnatic region in southeastern India. Earlier British victories at Arcot strengthened their claims in the Carnatic, while mounting costs forced France to reevaluate their position. This allowed for a peace settlement with the Treaty of Pondicherry, which settled colonial disputes in the region but did little to ease tensions on the home front. In addition to the British and French, other European powers were also entangled in colonial ambitions. Spain held vast territories in the Americas and focused on maintaining and expanding its influence in those regions. However, Spanish colonial interests often clashed with British ambitions, especially in the Caribbean, where control over lucrative sugar islands was fiercely contested. Meanwhile, in Africa, the Portuguese were striving to maintain control over their long-held trade routes and settlements along the western and eastern coasts. As an adversary of Spain, Portugal played a crucial role in the global trade networks that were vital to European economies, especially those who were also rivals of Spain, like Great Britain. In Europe, the status quo following the diplomatic revolution remained uneasy, and the aggressive expansionist policies of states like Prussia exacerbated further tensions. Friedrich II's rapid military buildup and territorial ambitions alarmed neighboring powers like France, Russia, and most importantly, the Habsburgs. It was here that Friedrich made his decisive move. In August 1756, he invaded Saxony, a neutral territory strategically significant for its resources and location. By seizing Saxony, the Prussians aimed to secure a vital position and preemptively disrupt the plans of their enemies who were forming coalitions against them. Saxony's capture not only provided Prussia with additional manpower and resources, but also served as a buffer zone against Austria. Friedrich's bold strike was a strategic gamble meant to assert Prussian dominance. The invasion itself triggered widespread alarm among the other European powers, with Empress Maria Theresa seeing it as a direct threat to her influence and Austria's territorial integrity. France, bound by its alliance with the Habsburgs, was drawn into the conflict, seeking to curb Prussian expansion and protect its own interests. Britain, allied with Prussia, viewed the invasion as a necessary step to counterbalance French ambitions and maintain its own colonial and trade dominance. Meanwhile, Russia, wary of Prussia's growing power, prepared to support Austria and France in the hopes of expanding its influence within Central Europe. Friedrich's actions led to a flurry of diplomatic and military maneuvers from all sides. The delicate web of alliances and enmities quickly unraveled, plunging Europe into a widespread and devastating conflict. This was not just a localized war, but a global struggle, as colonial and economic rivalries coincided with territorial ambitions on the continent. The greater tension that had been simmering for decades had finally erupted, and the 7 Years' War had begun. We just released a new video game for PC called Master of Command. It's set in the 18th century during the 7 Years' War. You can take command of one of 3 different armies per nation that each have their own strengths and weaknesses. That means you've got 15 totally unique historical armies like the Cossacks, Hanoverians, Grenzers, Hungarians, the Freikorps, and more to command through procedural campaigns that demand you adapt and plan carefully. The battles are real-time and the scale is massive, with up to 600 soldier models in one unit alone. These units are also fully customizable. In your camp, you can open up any regiment and fully customize its flag, uniform, facings, and even their hat. The battles are challenging, and the game offers many difficulty settings in case you want to fine-tune your campaign. There's also a ton of achievements, and just about every one of them has its own unlock, where you can collect up to 50 historical regiments. There are no microtransactions, no pay-to-win systems, and no grinding for a special currency. I've worked on this game for the last 2 years with our own development team, overseeing all of the historical details, designing all the units, and even crafting every battlefield. If you're a history buff who's interested in linear warfare, the 18th century, strategy games, or even roguelikes, I really think you'll love what we've made. The game came out today and has a launch discount, so get it now while it's on sale and see how you fare in commanding your own 18th century army.
Eure Majestät, Brown hat sich zurückgezogen. Sie ziehen sich über den Morellenbach zurück.
Wir kontrollieren das Schlachtfeld. Wir haben den Tag gewonnen.
Ohne Feldmarschall Keith hätten wir an diesem Tag verloren.
In der Tat.
Man sagt, diese Österreicher sind nicht mehr dieselben wie früher. Ich beginne das zu glauben.
On August 29, 1756, King Friedrich II led a force of 70,000 Prussians into Saxony. By September 9th, the king himself entered the capital of Dresden. But not all of the electorate was under Prussian control. In the southwest, Saxon forces under Count Frederick von Rutowski were stubbornly holding on to the fortress of Pirna. In order to dislodge them, Friedrich had to make sure the neighboring Austrians in Bohemia would not intervene. To do that, Friedrich decided to directly tie up the Habsburgs and formally declared war. Prussian forces under Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick immediately attacked the Austrians in Bohemia, while Field Marshal Kurt Christoph von Schwerin swept into northern Moravia. Opposing the Prussians was the Austrian Field Marshal Maximilian Ulysses von Braun, who was aware of Friedrich's attempts to divert the Austrian relief of Saxony. To address this, Braun set up a fortified position in the town of Buden and confronted the Prussians as they marched into the valleys around Lobositz on October 1st. Friedrich initially underestimated the Austrian army, expecting to face only a light skirmish rather than a full-scale defensive position. The battle was hectic, with the aftermath leaving roughly 3,000 casualties on either side. Friedrich's close subordinates convinced him that they had secured a tactical victory. However, Lobositz was part of a cunning strategy by von Braun, who used the battle as a cover for his maneuver to link up with the besieged Saxon forces at Pirna. Braun's swift movement nearly succeeded in breaking the siege, but the Saxon army failed to capitalize on this opportunity due to poor coordination and a lack of resolve. Ultimately, Friedrich's grip on Saxony remained unbroken, forcing the Saxons at Pirna to capitulate on October 14th, consolidating Prussian control in the early phase of the war. As the winter months set in, the Prussians went to ground, and King Friedrich set about planning for a new strike against the Austrians. The spring of April 1757 saw Prussia launch a fresh campaign, marching through mountain passes to converge on the Bohemian city of Prague. They were soon met by von Braun, who had concentrated the Austrians into a defensive position flanking the city. On May 6th, the two armies clashed. The fighting was fierce and costly, with Marshal von Schwerin losing his life in battle, while the opposing von Braun suffered mortal injuries that claimed his life nearly 7 weeks after the battle was over. Friedrich was able to contain the Austrians inside the city, laying siege to it for a short while. However, Marshal Leopold von Daun arrived with a relief force and engaged the Prussians at Kolin on June 18th. The battle was a humiliating defeat for the ambitious Friedrich, who was forced to abandon his campaign in Bohemia. As the king faced setbacks against Austria, the war expanded across new fronts. To the east, Russian forces under Marshal Stepan Apraxin invaded East Prussia, capturing the city of Memel in early July and securing a victory at the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf in August. While logistical challenges forced the Russians to withdraw temporarily, their entry into the war presented a new and formidable threat. But Russia wasn't the only surprise entrance. On September 13th, the Kingdom of Sweden declared war on Prussia, hoping to regain territory lost during the Great Northern War, and launched an invasion into Pomerania with 22,000 men. Adding to Friedrich's troubles, Hanover was also forced out of the war after French forces invaded and overwhelmed the Hanoverian army at the Battle of Hastenbeck. The disbanding of Hanover's military was finalized in the Convention of Klostertshaven, which was signed by the disgraced Duke William of Cumberland. Even worse, Friedrich suffered another humiliation when the Prussian capital of Berlin was raided by Austrian hussars under Count Andras Hadik in October. Not only was Friedrich grappling with multiple fronts, he also endured enemy incursion into his own territory. While Prussia was busy fighting the Austrians, their British allies were already engaged in a bitter struggle throughout North America. What began as disputes in the Ohio Valley had led to confrontations at Jumonville Glen, Fort Necessity, and Monongahela, with the two powers fighting to stake their claim in territories across North America. However, by May of 1756, the colonial feud began to erupt into a full-scale war, tying both Britain and France into the wider struggle throughout Europe and other parts of the globe. Early on, French forces in North America were at an advantage thanks to fortified positions and good commanders, like Louis-Joseph Marquis de Montcalm. Strong alliances with local Native American tribes also assisted French and Canadian troops in repelling British expeditions, while at the same time supported successful attempts to drive the British out of their claimed territories. The destruction of Fort Bull and later assault on Fort Oswego were crucial for disrupting British supply lines and demoralizing their troops. With British command hampered by indecision, delays in supplies, reinforcements, and general communication, the French were able to keep the British pinned down and off balance throughout the opening years of the war. By August 1757, General Montcalm had captured Fort William Henry, expelling the last British presence from the area of Lake George in New York, though the killing of captured British soldiers by Indian irregulars bred resentment on all sides of the conflict, meaning that skirmishes continued on the frontier as both sides prepared to campaign in 1758. Far off in South Asia, the Anglo-French struggle for domination over India had erupted into the Third Carnatic War. By 1757, the French town of Chandanagar was captured by the British under Admiral Charles Watson and Colonel Robert Clive, with the latter being a veteran of the First and Second Carnatic Wars. In that same year, the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, allied with the French and faced off against the British East India Company under Clive at the Battle of Plassey on June 23rd. The Nawab's army and his French allies heavily outnumbered the British, yet Clive was able to deliver a decisive victory in part thanks to the defection of several Bengali leaders and Siraj-ud-Dawla's subsequent flight from the battlefield. News of British success worried the French crown, who appointed Thomas Arthur Lally as Governor-General of French India and tasked him with ousting the British, though he would not reach India until April of 1758. Confrontations also played out across other regions of the globe. In 1756, French forces captured the British-controlled island of Minorca. The loss of this strategic naval base strained British operations in the Western Mediterranean, while allowing France to maintain a dominant position. In the Caribbean, skirmishes between French and British naval forces intensified as both sides sought to control lucrative sugar islands. Western Africa also saw confrontations between these two powers, with 1758 seeing British expeditions capturing the French territory of Senegal, along with the trading posts of Gorée and Saint-Louis, weakening France's hold on its African territories and disrupting the slave trade routes vital to the French economy. Back in Central Europe, the latter end of 1757 gave King Friedrich II a chance to recover from his earlier setbacks, thanks to a number of brilliant victories. On November 5th, Friedrich crushed the combined forces of France and the Holy Roman Empire at the Battle of Rossbach, inflicting heavy casualties on his enemies, all while keeping his own losses minimal. At Leuthen, the Prussians won another stunning victory on December 5th, as Friedrich's forces, outnumbered nearly 2-1, managed to rout an Austrian army under Prince Charles of Lorraine and Marshal von Daun. With the Austrians defeated in Silesia, Friedrich advanced on the city of Breslau, laying a siege that lasted until December 20th with the city's surrender. Friedrich's victories also gave the Prussians a chance to divert forces to address the Swedes in the north, who were left alone with a garrison force of 8,500 troops after their Russian allies retreated back to eastern Prussia. King Friedrich had dispatched 28,000 Prussians under Field Marshal Hans von Leyvault to oust the Swedes. Unable to join up with their French allies in the west, the Swedish army retreated back to the regional capital of Stralsund, allowing the Prussians to retake vast swaths of Pomerania by January of 1758, and keep the Swedes contained in Stralsund for the time being. In the same month, a new Russian army invaded East Prussia. Marshal Apraxin had been replaced by Count William Fermor, who had captured Memel in July of 1757. As the Russians re-established control over East Prussia, Fermor set about consolidating his forces, ready to march against the Prussian heartland. For the Western Front, Prussia's victory in the Rossbach campaign emboldened British politicians, who encouraged King George II to revoke the Convention of Klostertshaven and begin remobilizing the king's subjects in Hanover. It was time to fight back against the French. To help with this, the formidable Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick was enlisted, changing his commission from Prussian to Hanoverian. From his arrival in November of 1757, the Duke of Brunswick whipped the dejected Hanoverians into shape, and by the spring of 1758 had driven the French out of Hanover and back over the River Rhine. For King Friedrich, the Hanoverian offensives were crucial to securing the Prussian west flank, as pressure from the east began to worsen. By August, Count Fermor had led a force of 42,500 Russians on Friedrich's doorstep in Brandenburg. By the 24th, the king arrived opposite the Russian position at Zorndorf with 37,000 of his own troops. The next day, the two armies would clash in what would become one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Over 16,000 Russians and 12,800 Prussians would perish in an exhausting slog that yielded nothing more than a stalemate, leaving both sides to withdraw and recoup their losses. To his subjects and supporters, Friedrich proudly declared victory. In reality, the display at Zorndorf left him shaken and anxious about the Russians, who were not entirely repelled from Brandenburg. The situation grew more complicated as the Austrians, under Marshal Leopold von Daun, continued advancing from the south. A surprising victory against Daun at Hochkirch prevented the Austrians from taking Saxony, but the coming winter meant that neither side could make a decisive move. As 1759 rolled over, French forces in the west began to gain the upper hand against the Duke of Brunswick, withstanding numerous offensives and pressing him back. In July, the strategic fortress of Minden was lost, but Ferdinand pressed on to confront the French in battle. On August 1st, the Duke's finest hour arrived when he skillfully drew the French into a decisive engagement on the fields outside of Minden. While the French sported superior numbers, the Anglo-German troops stood their ground against repeated French assaults and cavalry charges. By midday, the French forces were in full retreat, and Ferdinand had secured a resounding victory that not only saved Hanover, but dealt a significant blow to French ambitions in Germany. Meanwhile, in the east, Prussia's strategic situation became more desperate. Russian forces under Count Pyotr Saltykov pressed further into Brandenburg, delivering a crushing blow at the Battle of Kay in July. By this point, Friedrich knew that a direct confrontation with the Russo-Austrian coalition was inevitable, as a combined force of roughly 76,000 men were drawing ever closer. In order to confront them, Friedrich took personal command of his army once again. He gathered over 50,000 soldiers to meet the advancing coalition at Kunersdorf, east of the Oder River. In the early hours of August 12th, Friedrich launched a flanking assault on the Imperial and Russian forces, determined to replicate his earlier successes. He was unaware of how entrenched the coalition defenders really were. Initially, the Prussian attack made headway and captured several key positions. But as the day wore on, Friedrich's forces became overextended and severely weakened by Russian artillery. After a series of futile assaults by the Prussians, the coalition army counterattacked, inflicting devastating losses and forcing Friedrich to withdraw from the battlefield. By the end of the day, the Prussians had lost 19,000 men. For King Friedrich, all seemed lost. His army lay in ruins as the coalition of Russia and Austria were poised to strike the capital of Berlin. Friedrich would need a miracle for his kingdom to survive the coming days. Elsewhere, the colonial wars raged on, as French and British forces traded volleys and cannon fire across North America, India, and the Caribbean. Meanwhile, in Spain, the death of King Ferdinand VI on August 10th paved the way for the ambitious Charles III. whose Bourbon connections to France would help in his vision to overhaul the faltering Spanish Empire, and in doing so, threatened to widen the conflict further. As the year drew to a close, it became clear that the Great War, which had enveloped the world, was not about to end anytime soon.
Dios pone a prueba nuestra paciencia, una y otra vez. Los británicos nos roban a plena luz del día, y ahora su almirantazgo disfraza este robo con leyes.
Majestad, no debemos dejarnos provocar. Una guerra con Gran Bretaña.
¿Provocación? Esto no es provocación, es una invitación. Aquella muestra cerca de Lagos hace unos meses, una humillación francesa. Y los portugueses, permitiendo los barcos de Boscawen. Tal traición. Creo que don José hace la vista gorda por el bien de sus aliados británicos. ¿Cuánto tiempo más debemos permanecer inactivos mientras se nos arrebata la dignidad? Hay que hacer algo. Dios lo quiere.
After years of frustration in North America, the British were set on winning it back. Both William Pitt and Duke Thomas Pelham Hollis of Newcastle called for an overwhelming commitment of men, resources, and local alliances in preparation for a three-pronged assault into New France over the summer of 1758. The first of these assaults failed miserably. General James Abercrombie's assault on Fort Carillon lacked adequate artillery support, which left the British soldiers floundering as they failed to punch through General Montcalm's defenses. The bloody defeat on July 8th left Fort Carillon remaining in French hands. General Geoffrey Amherst fared much better, capturing the coastal fortress of Louisbourg, which broke France's control over the St. Lawrence River and opened access to Quebec City. The last target was Fort Duquesne, long a thorn in Britain's western frontier. The British were repulsed after an assault in September, but Duquesne itself was eventually abandoned after the French garrison retreated a month later, giving Britain control over the Ohio Valley. Pitt's strategy to cripple French colonial power was in full swing by the dawn of 1759. A young and ambitious general by the name of James Wolfe was chosen to lead the campaign, thanks to his part in the capture of Louisbourg the previous year. Wolfe's forces were supported by a powerful fleet of the Royal Navy, which sailed the army up the St. Lawrence River in June. The following month saw Amherst succeed where Abercrombie had failed. After a short-lived siege of Fort Carillon in July, the heavily outnumbered French withdrew from the area. To add to Amherst's fortunes, the French also failed to destroy the fort as they pulled out, even after igniting its powder magazine. With Carillon and other forts like St. Frederick now under their control, British efforts could be focused solely on Quebec, and later Montreal. For months, General Wolfe besieged Quebec City, launching several daring but costly assaults, including a disastrous attack on Montmorency Falls. Wolfe refused to abandon the campaign, knowing that gaining Quebec would devastate France's position in North America. The gravity of the situation was not lost on the Marquis de Montcalm either, who had been reinforcing his defending army with a complement of local militias, native allies, and Marines. Like his enemy, Montcalm knew that Quebec's survival was essential to maintaining French control. However, the strain of Britain's naval blockade and continuous bombardment began to wear down both the city's defenses and its morale. Wolfe was not content to prolong the siege, especially with the approaching autumn and Canadian winter threatening to halt his campaign dead in its tracks. Instead, he chose to seize the city through a nighttime maneuver, landing his troops at the base of the cliffs just west of Quebec. Under the cover of darkness, his soldiers scaled the steep paths that led to the Plains of Abraham, an open field just outside the city. For the British, this was a risky maneuver that left them vulnerable. Lucky for them, General Montcalm believed that the landings were a feint and refused to send troops until it was too late to stop them. On the morning of September 13th, Wolfe deployed over 4,400 soldiers in full view of the French, forcing Montcalm into a swift and fateful confrontation that saw both commanders perish in battle. By September 18th, Quebec surrendered. Despite their losses in North America, the French had not given up their colonial ambitions in India. In 1758, Thomas Arthur Lally arrived in the French headquarters of Pondicherry with reinforcements from the French Navy and a complement of 2,000 troops. However, the timing was not ideal, since they landed in late April, halfway into the campaigning season. By then, British forces had already captured the French fortress of Mezelipatam, breaking their influence in the northern Sirkars region. With little time to spare, Lally set about his campaign to oust Britain from the Carnatic and regain French control. His first move was the swift capture of Fort St. David in early June. However, Lally's plans to march on the British headquarters of Madras were cut short when his naval ally, Admiral Anne-Antoine Dash, withdrew from the Indian coast to refit his fleet in Mauritius, leaving Lally's army in the lurch. The war effort was further hampered by internal strife, as Lally's temperament led to friction with the ruling French Pondicherry Council. His insistence on strict discipline and disregard for local customs also alienated Indian leaders, creating logistical obstacles. However, by December 1758, Lally was able to muster just enough men to lay siege to Madras, but the British were able to sustain a resolute defense of the city that forced Lally to lift the siege in early 1759. In September, Admiral Dash had arrived back to the Carnatic with much-needed relief for the beleaguered French forces, who were being blockaded in Pondicherry. Dash's breakthrough was risky, as the men and material he carried could have been destroyed by British ships. Yet he succeeded in bringing crucial reinforcements through the blockade. It should have been a small redemption for his earlier withdrawal, but much to Lally's despair, Dash immediately departed with his fleet for Mauritius once again. Worse still, the relief efforts did little, as the French remained outnumbered and under-resourced. By late 1759, the British and their allies had secured most of the Carnatic, ready to march on Pondicherry. Overall, 1759 was a year of extraordinary success for Great Britain, one they would deem Annus Mirabilis, or the Wonderful Year. Beyond North America and India, British victories against the French in the Caribbean and Western Europe came along critical naval victories at Quiberon Bay and Lagos, which left the Royal Navy unchallenged at sea and eliminated any hope of French plans to invade the British Isles directly. For Prussia, the year was not so wonderful. Following the disaster at Kunersdorf, Friedrich II and the remnants of his army were forced to retreat toward Berlin. The king himself was despondent and prepared for what seemed inevitable defeat. Yet against all odds, the Austro-Russian army's march on Berlin stalled. Even with their victory, Count Saltykov and Field Marshal Ernst Gideon von Lauden could not agree on the next course of action. Lauden was wary of overextending his forces into enemy territory without adequate supplies, while Saltykov was frustrated by his own logistical difficulties. Unwilling to risk their armies any further, Saltykov and Lauden withdrew from the field over September. The Prussians would remember this moment as the first miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Berlin was spared, and Friedrich was able to seize the opportunity to regroup. Though still outmatched, he began to rebuild his depleted forces, buying time for Prussia in what would be a grueling fight for survival. In 1760, Friedrich faced one of his most desperate moments when Austro-Russian forces thwarted his siege of Dresden in July. The following month, Sweden capitalized on Prussia's vulnerability, striking out with a 6,000-strong army to take the town of Prenzlau, though logistical issues forced them to withdraw. On top of that, Berlin itself was again raided and briefly occupied on October 9th for 4 days. Friedrich marched his army to confront the Austro-Russian detachment occupying his capital, knowing full well an even bigger force was waiting to bear down on him. But something he didn't know was Saltykov's reluctance to engage the Prussians in battle, who ordered a further withdrawal of Russian troops back across the Oder River on October 14th. Slowly but surely, Friedrich was able to scrape back enough resources to consolidate and rally his forces. A hard-fought victory at the Battle of Torgau in November left the Prussians battered and their resources dangerously depleted, but their chance of survival remained hopeful, in part thanks to financial support from Britain. For their part, British subsidy treaties provided their key German allies with the means to fund and maintain their armies throughout the war. On October 25th, King George II suddenly passed away. Many were worried that his successor and grandson, George III, might influence a shift in British foreign policy. These worries stemmed from George III's own desire for peace and indifference to William Pitt, who had been a major influence on the war up to this point. However, the new king officially prolonged the ministry on his ascension to the throne, and with it, British aid to their German allies continued. For the Prussians, this aid was welcome, since their situation grew increasingly dire throughout 1761. Russian and Austrian forces launched relentless offensives, pushing Friedrich's men to the breaking point. The fortress of Kolberg fell to the Russians, depriving Prussia of a key port and further strangling its supplies. Facing a war of attrition he could scarcely afford, Friedrich resorted to defensive tactics, fortifying positions and conserving resources wherever possible. His troops were worn down by constant marching and supply shortages, yet continued to fight tenaciously. In early 1762, a twist of fate shifted the balance. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, once Friedrich's fiercest opponents, died in January. Her successor was Peter III, and to call him an admirer of Friedrich would be an understatement. Upon his ascension to the throne, the ardent Prussophile immediately ordered a ceasefire, withdrawing Russian forces from the conflict. This sudden reversal would be known as the second miracle of the House of Brandenburg, lifting a tremendous weight from Friedrich's shoulders. With the Russian threat removed, Prussia could now focus on countering Austria without the constant fear of a two-front assault. The years of hardship had taken their toll, but Friedrich's gamble and resilience had paid off. Prussia, though bruised and battered, had survived the storm. During these pivotal years, Britain continued to press its advantage in the colonies. Following the capture of Quebec in September 1759, the focus shifted toward capturing the last French bastion of Montreal. This wouldn't be easy, as the onset of winter isolated British forces in Quebec, leading to supply shortages and outbreaks of scurvy among the troops. Following Montcalm's demise, his second-in-command, François-Gaston de Lévis, took over the defense of New France. In April 1760, Lévis launched a counteroffensive aimed at driving the British occupiers out of Quebec. This culminated in the Battle of Sainte-Foy, where they defeated the British and besieged the city. However, the arrival of British naval reinforcements in May forced Lévis to retreat back to Montreal. Resupplied and ready to march, General Amherst wasted no time, coordinating a multi-pronged assault against Montreal in the summer of 1760. This coordinated strategy overwhelmed the French defenses, and by September 8th, Montreal surrendered without significant conflict, effectively ending French rule in Canada and concluding major military operations in North America. Meanwhile, in India, the British East India Company continued its relentless campaign against French outposts. In 1760, British forces under Colonel Ericourt decisively defeated Lally's French army at the Battle of Wandiwash. Lally withdrew his remaining forces to defend Pondicherry, which soon came under siege from Coote in September. After months of resistance, the French stronghold fell in January 1761, with Lally himself becoming a prisoner of war. Pondicherry's capture left British supremacy in India all but assured. While these defeats were a heavy loss for France, they didn't yet spell the end. The ascension of Charles III to the Spanish throne in 1759 provided a new opportunity for France. Bound by family ties under the Bourbon dynasty, alongside a shared animosity for Great Britain, Spain and France forged the Third Family Compact in August 1761. This pact formally allied Spain with France against Britain on the world stage. Britain viewed war with Spain as inevitable and decided to strike first, declaring war on Spain on January 4, 1762. Spain's entry into the war was dramatic. Not only was another major power taking the place of Russia, it was a colonial empire big enough to rival Britain, whose king held family ties with Louis XV of France. The British were now facing two Bourbon enemies, with new fronts opening all over the world. Britain's own allies on the continent weren't safe either. While King Friedrich continued to fight for Prussia's survival, King Joseph I of Portugal came under threat, as Spanish forces launched a campaign into Portuguese territory over May of 1762, hoping to force the neutral nation to sever ties with Britain. King Joseph was underprepared for such a conflict and quickly sought British assistance, which responded by sending supplies and over 7,000 soldiers to defend its Portuguese allies. In the Americas, the Caribbean became embroiled in the Anglo-Spanish War. Any hope of a joint Bourbon invasion of British territories was dashed after the French lost total control of their Caribbean possessions. During June 1762, British forces launched a massive assault on the Cuban capital of Havana, which served as Spain's gateway to the Caribbean. After an arduous 2-month siege, made worse by disease and tropical heat, Havana surrendered. With its capture, Spain had lost one of its largest and most fortified colonial cities in the Americas, along with valuable naval assets that fell into British hands. Meanwhile, in South America, a Spanish expedition under Antonio de Ceballos set out from the Rio de la Plata region to seize a number of Portuguese outposts, all the while fighting off repeated counterattacks from Anglo-Portuguese forces. Across the Pacific, Britain claimed a bigger prize in September 1762, when a British expeditionary force from India arrived in Manila, quickly overwhelming the Spanish garrison and capturing the city. The loss of Manila was a major defeat for Spain, who were forced to surrender the rest of the Philippines while they concentrated on securing other fronts. Back in Europe, Russia's withdrawal had given Friedrich a much-needed respite, which he used to focus on his Austrian nemesis as he drove them out of Silesia. In the north, Sweden realized they had achieved little by 1762. With their resources dwindling and military effectiveness hampered, they withdrew from the battlefield, effectively ending their campaign against Prussia. Friedrich, now freed from both the northern and eastern threats, turned south. In October, Friedrich's younger brother, Prince Henry, achieved a final significant victory at the Battle of Freiburg, repelling an Austrian assault and forcing them to withdraw south toward Perna. In Western Europe, France poured the last of its reserves into a desperate series of offensives aimed at crushing Hanover for good, but these attacks failed thanks to the Duke of Brunswick. In May, A hard-won battle at Wilhelmsthal saw the Duke's weary troops push the French back, culminating in a final siege at Kassel that saw them capitulate on November 1st. By the end of 1762, both sides were battered, exhausted, and financially depleted. The European conflict finally came to an end in February 1763 with the signing of the Treaty of Hubertusburg. Although it left the European borders largely unchanged, the treaty affirmed Prussian control over Silesia and Glatz, marking its emergence as a key player in the European order, one which the Austrians were forced to recognize. Peace had drastically altered the balance of power in North America, the Caribbean, and Asia, however. The Treaty of Paris was signed in February of 1763, reshaping the colonial world. France ceded Canada and all of its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, effectively ending French influence in North America. And Spain, which had entered the war late, agreed to the return of British-captured Havana and Manila in exchange for Florida. The treaty formally recognized Britain's supremacy over the seas and in colonial holdings, solidifying its status as the dominant global power. In India, what few trading ports France had were returned, but the destruction of their fortifications rendered them worthless as military bases, giving the British East India Company a burgeoning monopoly that would last nearly a century, until it was replaced by the British Raj. As the ink dried on the two treaties of Paris and Hubertusburg, a new geopolitical landscape emerged, one that would shape the coming age of empire and sow the seeds for future revolutions.
The enemy will be suppressed, acknowledged.
After the Prussian conquest of Silesia in 1745, King Friedrich earned the title of the Great by his countrymen. Thanks to his military exploits against the Grand Habsburg coalition, this moniker became common use among many of Friedrich's contemporaries throughout Europe. The Prussian monarch had cemented himself as a hero of his people, but his triumphs came with a heavy toll for his kingdom. On the battlefield alone, Prussia suffered 180,000 casualties. Financially, the war left Prussia in a precarious spot. Extensive military campaigns and the need to rebuild devastated regions led to substantial debts, many of which were owed to Great Britain, which had provided subsidies to support the Prussian war effort. These debts necessitated fiscal reforms and increased taxation on lower income groups, which together placed additional burdens on the common people. For Friedrich's enemies, the consequences of the war had been even worse. In terms of total casualties combined, the Habsburgs and their allies lost over 762,000 men over the course of the war. Austria bore the brunt of these losses, and more humiliatingly for Empress Maria Theresa, they had nothing to show for it. Despite Theresa's determination to reclaim Silesia, the Treaty of Hubertusburg reaffirmed Prussia's control over the region, leaving Austria's ambitions unfulfilled. The Habsburg monarchy was forced to reassess its military strategies and internal governance, focusing on reforms to strengthen its weakened empire. Moreover, the broader Holy Roman Empire, which had been dragged into the conflict through Austria's alliances, faced economic devastation and internal discontent among its German constituents. Russia played a pivotal role in Prussia's near collapse, yet it also emerged in a more precarious position. The sudden death of Empress Elizabeth and the pro-Prussian stance of her successor, Peter III, abruptly ended Russian hostilities. Although Russia inflicted severe blows on Prussia, the withdrawal of its forces before the war's conclusion meant it failed to capitalize on its gains. Frustrated with Peter III and his German sycophancy alienating his Russian subjects, Peter's wife, Catherine II, overthrew him in a palace coup, becoming the new reigning empress of Russia. In France, the war had been a catastrophe. On the continent, its forces had fared well despite suffering defeats at battles like Rossbach, Minden, and Wilhelmsthal. But economically, France faced crippling war debts, and its failure to subjugate Hanover meant that their British rivals maintained a strong influence over their German allies. Even as King Louis XV began the difficult process of reforming and restructuring his battered kingdom, France's weakened finances and loss of national prestige would sow the seeds of discontent a few decades later would erupt into revolution. Even for the powers not heavily engaged in Europe, the war was a wake-up call. Sweden had entered the war attempting to reclaim land and influence lost in previous conflicts, but its involvement yielded little beyond economic exhaustion. For Spain, the Bourbon family compact tied its fate to France, but the war's conclusion exposed Spain's vulnerabilities. Military reforms in the post-war years aimed to modernize the Spanish army and navy, but their position remained secondary among the new great powers. Beyond existing belligerents, the war's shadow fell heavily on neutral and occupied states. Saxony, seized by Prussia in the war's opening campaign, was ruthlessly plundered, its coffers drained of $50 million, and its land ravaged. Towns lay in ruin, fields went untilled, and a population loss of nearly 100,000 reduced Saxony to a diminished power. Poland, though officially neutral, fared little better. Friedrich's debasement of currency wreaked havoc on its economy, while Russian troops used Polish land for winter quarters and supply depots, marking the beginning of a near-constant Russian military presence. For Great Britain, the 7 Years' War had been a hard-fought path to ascendancy. Not only had they secured Hanover in Central Europe, but they had thoroughly trounced the mighty French colonial empire. In North America, the loss of all French possessions to the British was perceived to be the end of future conflict in the theater. They were wrong. Between the struggle of these two colonial powers, the overlooked indigenous nations had been forced to choose sides. France's defeat left many tribes loyal to King Louis facing an uncertain future under British rule, while some who had been loyal to the British, like the Seneca, felt alienated with colonial encroachment. The British were eager to consolidate their newly won territories, which meant imposing their authority over the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Under General Geoffrey Amherst, the French custom of gift-giving and distribution of hunting supplies were cut off, while the British Army began rebuilding and manning former French forts throughout the annexed territories. Additionally, the British military did little to curb settler incursions into the Ohio Valley, which defied earlier agreements between the British and native peoples local to the area. American Indians were not the only people to suffer under British policy. Earlier in the conflict, the British had carried out the systematic expulsion of French-speaking Acadian settlers from Nova Scotia and other French territories. Fearing their allegiance to France and potential collaboration with enemy forces, the British forcibly removed thousands of Acadians from their homeland between 1755 and 1764 in what became known as the Great Upheaval. Families were separated, and many were resettled in distant British colonies. Acadians also sought refuge in Louisiana, a former French territory handed over to Spain in 1762. Spanish governance was minimal, making Louisiana ideal for Acadians seeking to preserve their French heritage. Between disgruntled French settlers and disaffected native peoples, many were not happy with Amherst's policies. Soon enough, the unrest among native communities sparked into open rebellion. From April 1763, a confederation of tribes led by the Ottawa chief, Pontiac, rose up against the British. Pontiac's warriors launched a coordinated assault on forts and settlements across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. Major forts like Fort Detroit and Fort Pitt came under siege, and smaller outposts were overrun. Major clashes like Bloody Run, Bushy Run, and the Devil's Hole Massacre left a festering animosity between the two sides. Over a 3-year period, Pontiac's coalition launched numerous raids across the British frontier, which in turn was met with British punitive expeditions that left racial tensions worse than ever before. To address these issues, the British government issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which sought to stabilize relations by prohibiting colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The proclamation was meant to placate Native American tribes by creating a buffer zone, but it infuriated colonial settlers eager to expand. Land speculators, especially in Virginia and Pennsylvania, saw their ambitions curtailed. For them, the British were gatekeeping vast territories many colonists believed was their birthright, earned through blood and hardship during the 7 Years' War. It appeared as though the British were favoring the natives over their own subjects. Meanwhile, the financial burden of maintaining garrisons in North America and defending the frontier grew increasingly heavy. With the national debt already doubled as a result of the 7 Years' War, new sources of income were needed. To offset these costs, Britain began imposing new taxes and trade regulations on the American colonies, which were deeply unpopular. Colonists resented paying for a standing army that they believed served British interests more than their own. Furthermore, colonial assemblies objected to the lack of representation in Parliament, crystallizing the ideological divide that would soon erupt into open rebellion. For India, the Treaty of Paris effectively ended French ambitions on the subcontinent. Pondicherry and other minor enclaves were returned, but they were to be retained as trading outposts under strict military limitations. Tragically, Thomas Lally was blamed for France's defeat in India and voluntarily returned home to face trial, and later, execution for treason. Meanwhile, the British East India Company was left free to consolidate their growing monopoly over the entire region. By 1764, the company had won a decisive battle against the Mughal Empire at Buxar, which not only secured them the area of Bengal, but forced the Mughal Empire to grant the company exclusive Diwani rights, allowing them to tax several key regions on behalf of the Mughal Emperor. And tax they did. With access to over 20 million people, the East India Company was able to generate over £2 to £3 million per year. Nothing was spared, from the manufacture of textiles to the pilfering of valuables, and even the complete disruption of the rice trade, which contributed in part to a devastating famine in Bengal over 1769 to 1770. Under company rule, Indian wealth was free for the picking. Overall, the 7 Years' War reshaped the global order. Britain emerged as the dominant empire, but its vast new territories in North America brought tension with indigenous nations and colonial settlers. Prussia's survival and military prowess elevated it to a great European power, rivaling those like Austria and France. Meanwhile, France faced a grim post-war reality. Territorial losses, economic strain, and growing calls for reform all planted the seeds of discontent that would later erupt into violent revolution. Though the war had ended, its aftermath would come to signal an ever greater change in world history. Don't forget to check out Master of Command, which released today. The game has a launch day discount, so get it now while it's on sale.